Across the purple sky, all the birds are leaving. But how can they know it's time for them to go? Before the winter far, I will still be dreaming. I have no thought of time. For who knows where the time goes? Who knows where the time goes? Sad, deserted shore, your fickle friends are leaving. But then you know it's time for them to go. But I will still be here, I've no thought of leaving. I do not count the time, for who knows where the time goes? Who knows where the time goes? And I am not alone while my love is near me. I know it will be so until it's time to go. So come the storms of winter and the birds in spring again. I do not fear the time. For who knows how my love grows? Who knows where the time goes?
It's still 1 minute to morning. Good morning. I'm so happy to be with you today. Thank you so much for that wonderful and ennobling music. In my almost 36 years of congregational ministry, I've intersected with this congregation in a number of ways. I have long friendships with your former senior ministers, both Forest Church and Galen Gingrich, and I've learned a lot from them. And I know that many of your members have been generous contributors to Unitarian Universalism, which I appreciated when I was vice president of the UUA. So there is much to esteem and admire in this congregation. I am a credentialed transition minister, just like Kathleen, and we often walk a fine line in this work. We both celebrate and love a congregation. And we also help them to examine their histories and experiences and harvest what can be learned from them. Congregations offer us a place to reflect upon our own lives and to think about what we can learn as individuals. And the same is true of a congregation. But especially in a large congregation, there is not one history to examine. There's a multitude of experiences and stories that are woven together to make this a multifaceted community of many points of engagement. I've now served 3 large congregations, and I know how complex they are. A congregation is not a static thing, but an organic organism. An organism that has some through lines, but not just one story. So since my topic is the blessings of congregational conflicts, you may be afraid that I'm here to deconstruct any difficulties you may have had in the past. In fact, this sermon is not only about conflicts that can arise in congregational life, it's also about the current environment in this highly divisive and polarized time. I do not believe that conflicts can be fixed. I believe that they are a normal and natural part of our lives, both individual and collective, that can either be destructive or life-giving, that there can actually be blessings that come from conflicts. It's not about avoiding conflicts, it's about finding healthy ways to approach them. I have, for better or for worse, become known as one of the experts in matters of congregational conflicts. I've seen conflagrations in congregations that have caused great pain and painful examinations that have left a congregation healthier than they had ever been. I imagine there are some among you who are doubtful of this assertion. I'm hopeful, if I cannot completely convince you that conflict can be a blessing, that perhaps you'll seriously entertain the possibility that conflict may not be all that bad. As I mentioned earlier, what I've learned most of all is that the difficulties in congregations cannot be fixed. Instead, I've realized that we have to start with the building blocks of community, individual people. Our culture has not really given us the tools to work with disagreements, as we can see all too well in the current volatile situation in which it seems like people feel like the only option is to castigate the other. So what I try to do is to give people a different set of tools than you may have had before. Tools that help you understand yourselves and your own patterns. Tools that help you de-escalate seemingly intractable disagreements. Tools that help you understand how your own examined inner turmoil can have negative effect on your relationships, on an organization, a system, or a congregation. And tools that show you that by working through these things, you can have a healthy effect on your relationships, your organizations, your congregations. A recent example, a few years ago, I conducted a workshop on conflict for a ministers' gathering. It began in a rather typical fashion. Everyone went around the circle and gave their check-in, and within 30 minutes, I knew that I had my work cut out for me. They were in dire need of finding tools to deal with the conflicts that they had, because fully 2/3 of them were experiencing incredibly difficult conflicts in the churches that they served. Many of them were about people in their churches reacting to the proposed revisions to Article 2, our EU Statement of Purpose. You may remember that this was something voted upon last June at our General Assembly that presents a way of thinking about our purpose that revolves around certain values, certain core values, love being at the center. I know Kathleen has been talking with you about this a lot, and you can see the new image on the back of your order of service. But one minister said that a congregant came to him absolutely furious. He said the UUA is just trying to force us to do things we don't want to do, and we will not stand for it. And my colleague innocently asked, where in this report do you see that? And he said, it's right here. It's right here where it says we. We didn't ask for anything like this. We didn't know that this was even coming. And what about having love at the center of this circle? What has love got to do with religion anyway? These conflicts arose out of real and painful differences, but neither of them could possibly be fixed by determining who was right or by making reasonable assertions. The people who were upset were most likely feeling that the ideals and principles which brought them to Unitarian Universalism in the first place were being taken away from them. I know that sometimes people can be bewildered that disagreements happen in churches. Aren't these supposed to be places of peace and harmony? Most people who think this aren't the slightest bit familiar with congregations. Conflicts happen because we're different from one another. That should be obvious, and most of the time it's not a big problem. But the difficulty arises when we feel misunderstood or judged in our differences, when we can't see a way to reconcile them. And conflicts such as this are never about facts. These kind of conflicts are about values. We come to church to explore our deepest values. What do we care about? How can we make meaning of loss and grief? What can we do to bring about change in the world? These are not factual questions. These are values questions. And engaging with them makes us quite vulnerable to one another. When someone questions our values, it can almost feel like an attack on our person, because values are at the heart of who we are. Our values are formed by our different personalities, what they make us predisposed to, by how we were raised and taught what was important, the cultures of our families and neighborhoods and professions that subtly form how we think about our lives. But rarely do we actually surface or question our values. They're implicit in how we live and how we interpret the world. And without really being conscious of it, we make the assumption that everyone sees the world the same way we do. The Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, minister of Middle Collegiate Church here in New York, said we're all wired by what we've experienced to be in search of a story with an ending, a story that feels like it has a completion. And the stories that we gravitate to are the ones that make sense to us, stories that fit, stories that feel like they have continuity, connection to the past, where we've been. Those stories that we will follow are the ones that we feel are true, feel like they've had continuity to our past and resonate with the trajectory of our lives. And so we're looking for the story that doesn't necessarily change our minds. We're actually looking for the story that confirms what's in our minds. So we pay attention to the stories around us that fit our own narrative of meaning and find ourselves bewildered when other people have a different story that makes sense to them. We constantly make assumptions about what surrounds us without even being aware of what we're doing. And those assumptions are necessarily different from one another. Or, as George Saunders said, I think, therefore I am wrong. After which I speak, and my wrongness falls on someone also thinking wrongly. And then there are two of us thinking wrongly. And being human, we can't bear to think without taking action, which, having been taken, makes everything worse. When we're suddenly confronted with the fact that others don't see the world that we do, the way we do, it can cause a kind of panic that makes us confused, defensive, sometimes angry. So what was happening in those conversations about Article 2 that I mentioned before was that each person, using very much the same words, came to conclusions that were radically different from one another, and offering rational observations was like throwing gasoline on fire. It was almost like they weren't even speaking the same language. What was happening was that those differences were so threatening, they were actually activating the part of our brain that responds when it feels under threat, the amygdala. In situations of high conflict, our brains literally shut down. When people feel physically or emotionally threatened to a high degree, what gets stimulated is that amygdala, the brainstem. It's the part of our brain that we share with every other living thing, so it's often called the lizard brain. The amygdala sees a threat, and it has only a few limited reactions, not thoughts. The amygdala's purpose is to help you make quick decisions in a crisis, so it shuts down access to the rest of your brain. So if you're expecting rationality from someone in this kind of state, someone that I would call amygdalated, it simply isn't possible. So let me be clear, sometimes having the amygdala screaming at you is the right thing, whether it's because we encounter a snake in our path or because people are saying or doing racist or sexist things. Our self-protective mechanisms serve an important purpose. But that being said, being in this state does not allow for mutual learning. If we manage to calm that amygdala, then other parts of the brain can begin to get engaged, particularly those that allow us to feel complex emotions. These parts of the brain are what we have in common with all other mammals, and they help us to bond with one another, to create connections, to develop empathy, to feel, rather than just react. When we can feel connected with one another, then we're more able to tolerate differences. And interestingly, some of the very behaviors that help us soothe our amygdalas are things that we do in church. Listening to music, engaging in rhythm, having quiet reflection time. All of these are actually strategies for helping us recover from emotionally demanding experiences. So then there's the neocortex, the part of the brain that allows us to think complex thoughts, to consider many possible ideas, to hold conflicting notions without feeling like we have to resolve them. This allows us to feel curiosity, to be open to new learning. But again, that part of the brain cannot be accessed if we feel threatened or fearful of losing our connection. So what if, instead of being protective or defensive of our own assertions, we ask the person that we're disagreeing with, what made you come to that conclusion? And not in a, why in the world would you think that kind of way, but an honest curiosity. What if, radical idea of radical ideas, we started questioning our own conclusions and perspectives? What if we came into a disagreement with the belief that disagreements exist because we have something to learn from one another? And can we bring these skills into our daily lives? This is the heart of the theory of conflict transformation. It's about trying to let go of our own assumptions to get to a place where we can imagine something different together. It's about recognizing that conflict will always be present, but we can find dynamic and adaptive ways to respond to it rather than react. When individuals become more aware of themselves and how their inner story may not match that other story, they can learn to be curious about those differences rather than feeling harmed by them. They can take this understanding into their congregational life, and the ripples of healthy behavior start spreading out. So I wish that all of my work in this arena has helped me to behave perfectly all the time. Alas, that is not the case. But I have to say that the moments of greatest growth in my life have happened when I have set aside my own convictions and positions and opened myself to truly listening and learning from others. I've had to learn the hard way that the point is not to be right all the time. The point is how to be effective in building relationships and solutions together. It's not always possible to approach conflict with hope and expectation. In fact, it often isn't the case, especially now when our partisan anxieties are completely ablaze. It's hard for me to really imagine being in a learning space right now with someone from the opposite side. But when I start to despair about that, I try to wind myself back down to a place that I live now, the people with whom I work now, the community that I work with here. If we can start to learn a different way of being, starting with ourselves, when we allow ourselves to let community into our hearts, to open ourselves to new possibilities, to relax our convictions and open our minds to one another, we are on our way to building what can truly be called a faith community, and then we can be on our way to building a better world. May it be so.